St. Augustine of Hippo was an esteemed late 4th and early 5th century Christian bishop in present-day Algeria. He became Bishop of Hippo, an ancient seaport city, in his early 40s, and remained in the position for the rest of his life. Known as one of the greatest Christian philosophers, St. Augustine was a prolific writer, with about 100 books, 300 letters, and 500 sermons still preserved. His work, which covered subjects including theology, philosophy, and sociology, has had a lasting influence on the Christian world. Among his most significant writings are The City of God, De Doctrina Christiana, and Confessions. The respected bishop was also a compassionate vegetarian and drew attention to the lifestyle of those who not only abstained from flesh and wine, but also from other viands, which flatter taste. He also quoted St. Paul, "It is better not to eat meat or drink wine, or to do anything else that will cause your brother or sister to fall." We will now continue with reading passages from St. Augustine of Hippo's substantial work, The City of God. He explains about devoting oneself to God, and more about the significant role of the true mediator, who, through his sacrifices, purifies and renews human nature. Book 10, Chapter 6, of the True and Perfect Sacrifice. A true sacrifice is every work which is done, that we may be united to God in holy fellowship, and which has a reference to that supreme good and end, in which alone we can be truly blessed. And therefore, even the mercy we show to men, if it is not shown for God's sake, it is not a sacrifice. For though made or offered by man, sacrifice is a divine thing, as those who called it sacrifice meant to indicate. Thus, man himself, consecrated in the name of God and vowed to God, is a sacrifice in so far as he dies to the world, that he may live to God. For this is a part of that mercy, which each man shows to himself. As it is written, "Have mercy on thy soul, by pleasing God." Our body too, as a sacrifice when we chasten it by temperance, if we do so as we ought, for God's sake, that we may not yield our members instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but instruments of righteousness unto God. Exhorting to this sacrifice, the Apostle says, "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercy of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service." If, then, the body, which, being inferior, the soul uses as a servant or instrument, is a sacrifice when it is used rightly, and with reference to God, how much more does the soul itself become a sacrifice when it offers itself to God, in order that, being inflamed by the fire of His love, it may receive of His beauty and become pleasing to Him, losing the shape of earthly desire, and being remolded in the image of permanent loveliness. And this indeed the Apostle subjoins, saying, "And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed in the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good, and acceptable, and perfect will of God. Since, therefore, true sacrifices are works of mercy to ourselves or others, done with a reference to God, and since works of mercy have no other object than the relief of distress or the conferring of happiness, and since there is no happiness apart from that good of which it is said, 'It is good for me to be very near to God,' it follows that the whole redeemed city, that is to say, the congregation or community of the saints, is offered to God as our sacrifice through the great high priest, who offered himself to God in his passion for us, that we might be members of this glorious head according to the form of a servant. For it was this form he offered, in this he was offered, because it is according to it he is mediator. In this he is our priest, in this the sacrifice. Accordingly, when the apostle had exhorted us to present our bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, our reasonable service, and not to be conformed to the world, but to be transformed in the renewing of our mind, that we might prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God, that is to say, the true sacrifice of ourselves. He says, "For I say, through the grace of God which is given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. For, as we have many members in one body, and all members have not the same office, so we, being many, are one body in Christ, and every one members one of another, having gifts differing, according to the grace that is given to us." Chapter 24. Of the one, only true principle, which alone purifies and renews human nature. It was truly said that man is cleansed only by a principle, that true and benignant Redeemer, brought low by his humility, manifesting himself to mortals by the mortality which he assumed, and which the malignant and deceitful mediators are proud of wanting, promising, as the boon of immortals, a deceptive assistance to wretched men. Thus, the good and true mediator showed that it is sin which is evil, and not the substance or nature of flesh. For this, together with the human soul, could without sin be both assumed and retained, and laid down in death, and changed to something better by resurrection. He showed also that death itself, although the punishment of sin, was submitted to by him for our sakes without sin, and must not be evaded by sin on our part, but rather, if opportunity serves, be borne for righteousness' sake. For he was able to expiate sins by dying, because he both died, and not for the sin of his own. The principle is neither the flesh nor the human soul in Christ, but the word by which all things were made. The flesh, therefore, does not by its own virtue purify, but by the virtue of the word, by which it was assumed, when the word became flesh and dwelt among us. For speaking mystically of eating his flesh, in the book of John, chapter 6, verses 53 through 55, Holy Bible, when those who did not understand him were offended and went away, saying, "This is a hard saying, who can hear it?" He answered to the rest who remained, "It is the Spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing." The principle, therefore, having assumed a human soul and flesh, cleanses the soul and flesh of believers. Therefore, when the Jews asked him who he was, he answered that he was the principal, and this we carnal and feeble men, liable to sin, and involved in the darkness of ignorance, could not possibly understand, unless we were cleansed and healed by him, both by the means of what we were, and of what we were not. For we were men, but we were not righteous, whereas in his incarnation there was a human nature, but it was righteous, and not sinful. This is the mediation, whereby a hand is stretched to the lapsed and fallen. This is the seed ordained by angels, by whose ministry the law also was given enjoining the worship of one God, and promising that this mediator should come. Peaceful viewers, we appreciate your company for today's program entitled The City of God by St. Augustine of Hippo, Vegetarian, The True Mediator, selection from Book 9 and 10, Part 2 of 2, on Words of Wisdom.